I feel the pressure rising under every quiet breath. I'm trying not to lose. A tremor in the distance crawls along the edges of the shape you left behind. The world inside my ribcage turns and folds until the veins begin to spark. A current pulling memory apart from everything I swore that I would keep. Your voice is like a shadow stitched to places I can never reach again. And all the fragile moments crack and scatter when the night decides to move. I chase the fading signal burning somewhere underneath my weary skin. A fracture in the rhythm cuts a path between the doubts I couldn't bury. A brace against the echo of the choices that refuse to disappear from me. The lines we drew are trembling now, collapsing in the spaces they created. A solid kind of violence pours between the shifting layers of the dark. And still I walk through everything we never had the courage to admit. The air is full of static, pulling at the wires we built around our fear. A thought of you unravels like a thread that drags the daylight out of you. It hurts to hold the pieces of the moments I pretend it didn't matter. But every time I try to let them go, they claw their way right back inside. I stand within the tension of a truth we never learned to breathe aloud. And feel the Veinlash curling through the part of me that never stopped its burn. Oh, the night becomes a mirror, bending every pulse into a different shape. A fractured kind of clarity arrives and breaks the silence at my back. The past is like a doorway splitting open when the weight becomes too much. And everything I fought to keep together slips between my shaking hands. I move across the fault line where our failures carved a map beneath the dust. And find the trace of something real still trembling in the ruins we became. The world returns in fragments, each reflecting what we never dared to face. A surge of light ignites the corridors that used to hold our restless ghosts. The ghost of who I was keeps trying to escape the boundaries I trusted. But little by little I feel the wire tighten just enough to make me stay. The truth is that I'm learning how to stand inside the fire without breaking, and letting every shattered piece align itself into a form I recognize. Oh, I rise within the aftermath and breathe against the weight of what remains. The darkness folds and carries all the scars that taught me where to go. I walk into the tension with a heart unarmed but ready for the impact. The silence shakes and all the restless shadows gather into honest light. A pulse of something newer cuts across the ashes we left in the distance. And I become the version of myself that Veinlash tried to pull awake. A rising tremor winds along the spaces pressed beneath my careful breath. It pulls a hidden memory through the cracks I never meant to open wide. The light inside my ribs begins to twist into a shape I barely recognize. A muted spark is growing where the darker parts of me refuse to bend. I feel the faintest motion carve a line across the weight I used to hide and turn into art. Hum softly through the tension folded in my chest. A distant pressure gathers where my oldest fears were waiting in the dark. It slides between the fragments of the thoughts I try to keep contained. The fragile truth beneath my breathing starts to through the remnants with a steadier resolve beneath my breathing. The quiet shifts and shows a path that wasn't meant to stay concealed. A thin new rhythm holds the fragments close enough to form a future. The dim inside my chest unfolds and clears a space for something true. A final spark escapes the dark and settles warm within the open air. And I become the version of myself, turn into what you're trying to find. I feel the fracture forming in the dim between the thoughts I couldn't name. A fading light is pulling through the seams. I try to keep from tearing wide. It drifts across the quiet space where all my guarded pieces learn to hide. And every muted memory returns and shakes that blur before they settle. I chase a subtle motion bending underneath the weight of unsaid truths. A trembling whisper curls around the edge of something I believed was gone. Your shadow moves like static, tracing patterns through the corners of my chest. It flickers with a clarity that hurts to recognize, but still feels real. Oh, the tender break between the lies and what remains begins to open slow. I breathe against the pressure of the things I swore would never surface. A fragile kind of trembling rise upward through the folds we never fix. And fate render gathers form inside the places long and tried to burn. A distant spark unravels where the darker parts of me refuse to bend. It cuts a path that opens through the remnants I pretend it didn't matter. I step across the trembling line dividing who I was from who I'm becoming. A rhythm in the silence drags the truth into the open without warning. It stings to recognize the echoes of the choices I abandoned, but still I hold the flicker like a shard of something barely living. The world reshapes in pieces, breaking loose from everything I clung to. A quiet rush of color seeps along the fractures spread across my ribs. And though it hurts to see the shape of what I hid beneath my breathing, the softness in the fading edges starts to draw a map towards something real. A pulse of recognition winds around the secrets I discarded. And faint render rises slowly where the weight begins to loosen. The tension folds and opens like a door I was not ready to confront. A shifting glow is weaving through the hollow of the moments left unfinished. I watch the past dissolve into the air and scatter into fragile threads. They twist around the shadow of the person I allow myself to be. A hesitant becoming starts to build beneath the surface of my fear. And through the blur I feel the truth, relearning how to speak my name. I step into the remnants with a heart still trembling from the ache. The silence bends but does not swallow all the parts I fought to salvage. A steady shape begins to bloom in places I believed were lost to ruin. The fractured lines align and guide me farther than I dare to move. A final spark escapes the dim and settles gently where the light returns. And I become the version of myself, faint render, try to wake again. Spark is drifting through the narrow space beneath my steady breath. It winds along the border where the thoughts I tried to bury start to rise. A distant tremor presses through the remnants scattered in my shaking hands. It hums inside the fragile parts I never let the light uncover fully. A single moment bends the path I thought would never let me change. The tension in my heartbeat draws the outline of the person I avoided. A drifting clarity arrives and stirs the dust that settled on my past, and I can feel the turning of a truth I'm finally strong enough to face. The air begins to vibrate with a rhythm woven through my cautious steps. A subtle spark is threading through the stories I once feared to open. I walk into the remnants of the days that held me far from what I needed. A quiet reconstruction shapes itself along the edges of my doubt. The map of who I was reshapes beneath the pulse of something honest. And static line grows brighter as the pieces start aligning into place. A fractured light is pushing through the patterns I believed were permanent. It draws a contour of the changes I refuse to let myself imagine. I breathe into the moment where the older version of me starts to loosen. The silent weight of everything I lost begins to fall away in threads. A hesitant resilience forms from places I assume were too far gone, and I can feel the shift of letting go without collapsing underneath it. I step across the threshold of a truth still forming in my open hands. The distance I once feared begins to fold into a path I can walk through. A steadier rhythm builds along the spaces I once filled with hesitation. The dim inside my chest unfolds and carries light into the fractures. A clearer shape emerges from the echo scattered deep beneath my breathing, and I become the version of myself static line was waiting to reveal. A fading shimmer gathers in the space beneath my restless breath. It moves along the edges of the thoughts I never dared to trace. A distant surge is forming where the darker parts of me once drifted. The world inside my chest unfolds and lets a fragile warmth appear. I walk into the remnants of the days I tried to leave behind in shadows, and now their stars rising softly through the places shaped by fear. A trembling clarity is threading through the fractures in my breathing. It draws a hidden image from the corners I refuse to let strength emerges from the shadows I once let define me. It weaves a patient rhythm through the layers I believed unchangeable. The scattered pieces gather shape and find their place beside my voice. I step into the openness of a future forming softly in the dark. A final spark escapes the dim and settles warm within my breathing, and I become the version of myself Navesh waited to reveal. A trembling rush is rising in the hollow where my guarded breathing sinks. It curls along the border of the thoughts I never learned to say aloud. The world inside my chest begins to shift beneath the weight of recognition. A muted spark is forming in the fragments I believe are far beyond repair. I feel the pressure bending through the space. It's shaped by everything I hid. A noise vessel starts to hum on a fog line running through my ribs. A distant tremor gathers where the shadows press against my trembling voice. It moves with quiet certainty that cuts between the lies I used to trust. The broken parts I carry pull together in a shape that feels unfinished. I breathe into the remnants of the days I try to in the dark. A fragile warmth appears inside the corners I refuse to let unspoken. Still the vessel turns the dim into a form that wants to stay. A restless rhythm filters through the memories I tried to leave behind. It winds around the tension held too tightly in the echo of my pulse. The shifting light uncovers truths that drifted far beyond my reach. I brace against the weight of understanding as it rises through my spine. A softened clarity begins to carve a map across my hesitating hand, and all the edges blur until the past no longer knows my name. The air grows heavy with the pulse of every moment I concealed. A trembling brightness threads itself between the layers of my doubt. I walk into the remnants of the person I believed I had to be. The pressure in my breathing draws the outline of a truer shape. A quiet shock of realization fills the gaps I once avoided. A noise vessel lights the path toward what I never dared to hold. Steady forming in my breath. The darkness folds and leaves behind the truth that learned to follow. A wider path begins to clear across the doubts I once believed were endless. The rhythm builds and pulls me forward with a quiet sense of purpose. A softer dawn escapes the noise and settles gently into place, and I become the version of myself. Noise vessel try to waken me. A trembling whisper rises from the heart thoughts remain. It threads itself along the places I pretended were already gone from me. The dim beneath my ribs begins to turn as if remembering its shape. A fading spark is crawling through the seams I tried so long to reinforce. I feel the pressure bending softly through the weight I never dared to name. And fall under skin begins to move where all my guarded fractures slip. A distant current slips between the shadows pressed against my breathing. It circles every fear I built and breaks the silence without violence. The parts of me once buried start to surface in a quiet trembling light. I trace the line dividing who I was from who I'm learning how to find. A fragile rhythm pulses underneath the remnants I refuse to carry. And still the skin grows warmer as the truth begins to form again. The world unfolds in pieces stitched with echoes of forgotten clarity. A shift inside my chest reveals the paths I never thought were real. The trembling color in my hands begins to lift the veil of hesitation. I breathe into the fracture where the past releases what it held too tight. A softened glow surrounds the pieces, falling gently into recognition. Fall under skin returns the voice I wasn't strong enough to keep. A distant brightness drifts along the corridor beneath my guarded spine. It lingers on the fragment shaped by all the times I ran from feeling. A tender ache unravels what I thought would never learn to loosen. The shadows I believe were permanent begin dissolving into air. A quiet change is rising through the bones I feared were set in stone. And I can feel the tremor of becoming someone braver than before. Braver than before. The tension in my heartbeat opens doorways through the ache I left behind. I step into the stillness where a hidden warmth begins to gather. The lines that marked my hesitation blur into a shape that feels familiar. A deeper calm arrives through places I forgot could carry light. The broken parts align and lift the weight that kept my breathing shallow. And fall under skin awakens what was waiting underneath the quiet. Beneath the quiet. Beneath the quiet. I walk into the open with a softer strength unfolding in my chest. The darkness bends and shows the truth I kept too distant from myself. A wider path emerges through the remnants scattered at my feet. The rhythm shifts and guides me toward a future I can finally hold. A single spark escapes the dim and settles more behind my steady breath. And I become the version of myself. Fall under skin was meant to find. A trembling rush is rising in the hollow where my guarded breathing sings. It curls along the border of the thoughts I never learned to say aloud. The world inside my chest begins to shift beneath the weight of recognition. A muted spark is forming in the fragments I believed were far beyond repair. I feel the pressure bending through the spaces shaped by everything I hid. And noise vessel starts to hum along the fall line, running through my trembling brightness threads itself between the layers of my doubt. I walk into the remnants of the person I believed I had to be. The pressure in my breathing draws the outline of a truer shape. A quiet shock of realization fills the gaps I once avoided. A noise vessel lights the path toward what I never dared to hold. A distant glow emerges from the fractures spreading through my chest. It weaves a line across the memories I locked away to keep from shaking. The version of myself I lost returns in pieces soft enough to carry. I feel the turning of the moments I abandoned in my fear. A slow becoming rises from the ashes of the silence I accepted. And now the shape I see is one I'm finally ready to confront. I step into the open air with something steady forming in my breath. The darkness folds and leaves behind the truth that learned to follow. A wider path begins to clear across the doubts I once believed were endless. The rhythm builds and pulls me forward with a quiet sense of purpose. A softer dawn escapes the noise and settles gently into place. And I become the version of myself. Noise vessel try to waken me.